so many times, like the issue is not a financial issue. The issue is a emotional attachment or emotional behavior that is causing this thing that they don't want to happen. If you're bloated in payroll, if you're bloated in expenses, you're never going to ever, like, these are behavioral things. Like we're just overspending, we're overdoing the stuff.
Today's episode of the ProGuide is brought to you by Small Pond Productions, the producers of this podcast. If you're looking to boost your brand's voice with professional end-to-end podcast production, whether it's an interview show or telling stories with audio, we walk you through every step of the process to make you sound great. Head to our website and download the free Podcasting Made Simple guide. 8 critical things you need to know before launching your brand's podcast. It's all available at smallpond.productions. Well, hey everybody, welcome to this episode of the ProGuide, where we learn from thought leaders in business technology, creativity, and productivity. And today we have Phil Sanders with us. Phil helps entrepreneurs increase their financial results along with their core team and increase their confidence and certainty. And Phil's 3 businesses, 3 Pennies, Foster, and Citizen Supply, along with investment and mentorship, gave him the wisdom and experience he needed to fuel others for their entrepreneurial journey. Phil, thanks for hanging out with us and chatting a little bit.
Yeah, for sure. I'm really happy to be here, man.
I love to start some conversations off this way with the question, you meet somebody, you're at a party or an elevator or something where you're just kind of hanging out with somebody for that 20 or 30 seconds and they say, hey, what do you do for a living? And it's something sometimes that probably doesn't come as easy until you've kind of honed it and got it down to where it's like I can transfer understanding pretty easily. What do you say to somebody who's just like, hey, what does Phil Sanders do for a living?
Yeah, I mean, I solve people's financial problems in their business. So at least that's what I do now. You know, I mean, there's no straight line from where I started to how I got where I am now, you know? So I think so much of what I have done has been, hey, what doors are open? Which ones are closing? Keep trying to get through the doors that are opening and like make it make more and more sense as we go along to kind of match my unique set of strengths and also life circumstance and all that stuff. So been in entrepreneurship for about 15 years now. So been in the consulting side of the house for year and a half. It's
interesting the way you describe that because I picture, delta in life course correction, delta course correction. Doesn't sound like it's a very straight A to Z story there for you. Talk to me a little bit about that journey. How did the zigzag show up for you? And did you have something, an end in mind from the beginning? Or was it over time you're like, okay, I think this next step is what makes the most sense for me?
I think we all have our hopes and dreams or the way we want our life to look like. Sometimes it's, you want more peace, you want more joy. Sometimes it's more something that's not as tangible. I started my entrepreneurship journey when I was like 22 years old. So when you're that age, you don't know enough about anything to really, like, if the end in mind I had then was like not even what I care about now. Does that make sense? So I think that there's just so much that has shifted. So like 3 Pennies, photography, graphic design, we started that business because of time. Like I was working at Starbucks before that, and it was, my wife and I were newlyweds, and it was, how can we just get more in control of our time? And it was just like, it was kind of the gateway drug for us from like an entrepreneurship standpoint, just photography, graphic design, pretty accessible, from a Starbucks standpoint. Like if we shot 5 weddings, I'd totally replace my income. And to me, from a risk standpoint, I was like, we can do this, Then it was, my time is my money. Like now my time is, if I'm not shooting, I'm not making any money. And so then it was, we started a co-working space called Foster downtown Atlanta. And that was solving a problem for this community of solo kind of creative entrepreneurs. So we kind of built it out of a community that we were in, and then we navigated towards that. And then the issue with that was, hey, the building isn't big enough to have enough employees to fuel the funds we need in life. Downtown Atlanta, growing family, those kinds of things. One of the things we did out of that space was we threw this kind of once a quarter makers market, and it ended up being like super, super cool, a lot of fun, invited the community into it, made a lot of money for those vendors. And so there's a really big development that was happening downtown Atlanta. They were converting like an old Sears and Roebucks to kind of like a live, work, play, which is basically the new mall, So they were converting that, and then they saw that Makers thing, and they're like, hey, would you want to do that as a full-time shop here? And so then we took over this like 12,000 square foot thing, and I got into retail. And so that solved the money problem. But then I was back in this time issue because it was sucking all my time into it, right? So I think from the consulting side, we can dive more into the story, but just like all those things, like I was always trying to solve a problem that was based in my own life and really around like, hey, how I wanted to live it. Because I'm a huge believer that in your 20s, it's about experiencing, it's about getting in front of ideas, go to places, like do these things so that wherever you land, you're making it most possible for wherever you land to like be what you actually want, And I was lucky enough to have parents that we traveled together. I got to see the world. I got to see some of these things. And so I had, my expectations weren't always around the money side. Like, hey, how much money do I need to earn? Or, I wasn't really in that space. It was more of like, how free am I? How free am I to choose? How free am I to spend my time how I want to spend my time? Am I hanging out with the people I want to hang out with? Are they pushing me? Am I growing? Like those kinds of things. And so, and then as kids and everything kind of came into the picture, like that changes a few things. But overarching, life has been really great. And even when the finances were low, it's like a really rich life.
For a little bit of what I hear from your story thus far is the idea of obstacle removal, constraint removal. So here's the next thing I'm bumping up against, it's time. Here's the next thing I'm bumping up against, it's money. And kind of finding your way around that. And also the way that you communicate, I don't hear a whole lot of like ego, like detachment, like, oh no, it's me, I'm like, it's just like, okay, this is the next thing. Let's take care of the next thing. How do you get to that point? Because I know not everybody starts there. A lot of times people, when they do creative work or they put their life's work on the line, it's really difficult not to say like, hey, I am the work and it's me and I identify with that. Talk to me a little bit about that space in there. Is there a little bit of a mental game, or is it just like, you know what? It just never was an issue for me. I'm just thinking externally most of the time and just, okay, what's the next step? What's the next thing we got to do?
I mean, ego. So the question is, how do you get rid of ego? You get the kicked out of you over and over and over again, and you realize like a lot of things, but you realize it's not all about you, and you realize the correct order of things, and you realize even if you do something great, it can still go bad. So I think, I'm coming out of a season of like the worst kicking of all time for me. And that it's a few years in the rear view now, but it's definitely you understand how fragile the ecosystem is, and it doesn't care like your capabilities or what you're entitled to or anything like that. It's interesting because ego, I think, plays such a huge role in like, honestly, like a marketing conversation. I feel like it's a big kind of word that's being used, and I think the only way to really check it at the door truly is self-awareness. It's like, hey, like only you, like people can hide it really, really well. And I think anybody has a really high BS meter for like when somebody's kind of in it for themselves, or when something's at play that isn't for the betterment of the group or the thing that they're saying it about, So I don't necessarily know if this is answering your question, but I think like humility for me, like I definitely fit that kind of visionary role, or that like those strengths of like, hey, future oriented, like something bigger than myself, like this just, we're going to go high, hard goals all the time. We're going to go 100 miles an hour towards it. And I think that I've seen some real benefits of that, in the sense that like we got so much farther on certain things than I ever thought possible, got some really cool opportunities, had a really great team, those kinds of things. It also leaves a wake of destruction because everything's so fast. You're not really making sure your foundation is sure. And so I think the humility is, it's one of those things I think people really, really want. And I wanted, or, the pieces of humility, but like the only way I got it is by absolutely being destroyed, So I think humility for me, honestly, like it comes from a space of brokenness. Like it comes from a space of, I don't have all that it takes. But that posture, honestly, like has built so much strength, like like, hey, I can do a lot by myself, but also when we go into relationships, like it's a collaboration and we were creating something together, and both sides of it, us working together, is a place that is like, what we can create is something that couldn't be done by ourselves.
When you're leading people in a direction that you feel like, hey, you need to go, there's probably some uncomfortable space that we have to wade into here in order to get what it is that you say that you want out of life. How have you learned to kind of approach that in the best way possible? Year and a half, it's not the 17 years of experience, but it is enough to be able to have probably, I'm sure, a conversation or two where it's like, man, I don't know if you want to hear this or not, but this is where we're headed.
I think the main thing is, like, from a consulting side, or like, I guess it's less about that. It's honestly like, what's my role in this? And one of the main ways I see my role is as like a truth sayer. And so if somebody hires me to come in and look at their finances, the outcome that they want, the way we get there is, for them, it's a lot of times very painful, Mm-hmm. And I think it's the same thing, you think about, hey, I want to get healthy. There's a ton of pain involved in getting healthy. You're cutting foods you love, or you're being disciplined in a nutrition plan, or disciplined in some exercising. Like, it's not just, so I think we all want these things. So I think from hey, these are the outcomes I get people want that outcome, but to get to that outcome, we really find out how committed they are pretty quickly. And I think that the thing that I uniquely bring to it is that, hey, I have so much empathy for that painful process, because like I've been there. So I don't ask people to do something that I haven't done, because a lot of times, like when we talk about business, the conversation from so many, call them gurus, call them whatever, but the conversation in the market is like typically around marketing and sales. Like, you scale those two things, and to a degree it's correct. Your revenue needs to continually grow for you to continue to afford the growth of your business. But if you're selling something at the wrong margin, then you'll never, ever, ever be in a healthy place from a financial standpoint. If you're bloated in payroll, if you're bloated in expenses, you're never going to ever, like, these are behavioral things. Like we're just overspending, we're overdoing the stuff. And I think that so many times, like the issue is not a financial issue. The issue is a emotional attachment or emotional behavior that is causing this thing that they don't want to happen. Does that make sense? So when we get into
it's a downstream effect of it. Yeah.
Oh yeah. And I think, when I started kind of it's interesting because like when my last business was, I left it not willingly. I left it because when the pandemic hit, we were, like I said, that brick and mortar retailer. And our solution was, hey, you're an online direct consumer brand with no brick and mortar for a customer to interact with your product in real life. We'll be that for you. So when COVID hits, we are brick and mortar only, no e-commerce solution. So we were like uniquely positioned to be destroyed. And we were. And so we kind of had to take on some debt, a lot of debt. You do the best you can. And we had really wise counsel around this. But what happened, like long story short, is we just got to this point of the only way forward was more debt, which is more risk. And as bad as it was, we knew it was going to potentially very likely get worse. So I had to call it, leave it, shut it down, but walk away with a ton of personally guaranteed business loans. So when I left that, you leave it with no money, and you got to go make money because you got a family. So this kind of valley I went through when I started working with businesses, because the size that I built that one to, they were like, well, how did you do this? How did you build this team and all these things? And so I kind of got started in more of like a general sense, like, hey, what does it look like to build a big team, operating system, those kinds of things. And then, but the problem behind the problem almost always was financial, like almost always, especially in the business sense. And the problem behind the financials was like a mentality or a mindset or some kind of behavior. It wasn't about the money. Like, everybody knows,
that's right.
Revenue minus expenses equals your profit. But, you got to spend less than you make, but everybody's spending more. America as a whole is just in debt. So I think that there's just this interesting thing where we are all complaining about not having enough money. right? But I see very few people controlling the things that they can control and doing something about it. And we think we're owed. I say we. I put myself in this category too. We think, hey, I need a 4Runner and I need a $70,000 truck. You know, we need those 2 cars. We need a room for every one of our kids. We need to eat from a farmer's market. I don't know what it is. I'm just saying things, but it's just
there's mental markers about like what doing well looks like. Yeah.
I have to have Netflix and HBO Max. I have to have $150, $250 worth of streaming services. And I think that like the thing that's so interesting is you get the quickest way to get what you want is by doing surgery, like cutting, like you cut, like just cut. And I think that that's what's so interesting is everybody's back to that initial point. So many entrepreneurs are looking at sales growth, marketing growth is like, hey, we got to keep up and to the right, always up and to the right. You know, we got to keep that mentality, but they're doing that to compensate for all the bloat down here. And so our brains are at capacity. So we're always at capacity, you know, and I think that a lot of this new way I'm doing things is just like, hey, I basically cut everything down to our literal bare minimum. I mean, we had no money. We ended up going bankrupt. So we literally had nothing. So a lot of this was being forced to this position and then making sure we're doing this well. Like I'm showing up for my wife, showing up for my kids, showing up for my family. And then the way I'm building back is nothing compromises these priorities. Nothing compromises this. Okay, so business demand. Okay, is it really a business demand? Do I just need to adjust something else? You know, like do I need to reorder some things? For instance, like, I don't have any way of doing marketing like this consistency. Let's just say, like, you know, because the drum that everybody's beating is like you post every day, all the time, like and it's just like it's insane. It's like, okay, I don't have time to do that. What if I just, you know, did it 3 times a week and text the people in my network that could probably use my service or called them, you know, 5 a day. Like I've gotten so much more business that way than I have following the path of just noise, you know? So I don't know if these are great examples, but what I'm trying to say is we're sitting on so much more than we realize as far as like a path to what we really want. And I think so much of what we want is really just in the house with us, or, you know, like in ourselves, even like to go even closer. It's like, you know, it's just in our own being, you know, to go deeper within ourselves, exercise, like those kinds of things. It's just right there. Like the satisfaction you get from that is, I've experienced companies that do millions, and I've experienced companies that, you know, just do right about 100,000. And the difference of happiness that money made in my life doesn't even compare to the joy, depth in relationship, depth in your own life.
Listening to this, I hear the themes of, you know, stripping down to the bare minimum and then realizing what the essence actually is, you know. It reminds me of the story of, you know, integrity, you know, the word integrity meaning stripping away the impurities of and just seeing what the essence of something is there that remains. A lot of first cause story I hear. It's so easy. You know, when we want to like read traction and get the EOS thing going or figure out how to do agile, it's like, it's so easy just to mask the behavior, figure out like, because I want it to be practical. I don't want it to be a matter of the heart or a mental thing. And we use that behavior to mask what it is that really just, like you said, needs to be done, can be done immediately if we're willing to be aware of it or expose ourselves to it. But we're tricky people. You know, we're tricky. We like to fool ourselves a lot, I think, sometimes, where it's just, you know, it's so much easier to lie to ourselves and try and work on something downstream than it is to go all the way upstream to the first cause where things are really, really like, I want to protect that ego. Talk to me a little bit about what you do currently or most recently, or what you feel like you would do if you found yourself to be in a spot where, you know, I know I'm coaching other people, but I personally feel a little bit stuck here right now. So like whether it's with a problem that they bring to you or whether it's just, you know, personally, I'm helping them and that's going great. But you just personally in this one area, I just feel like I'm snagged. I don't know what to do.
I mean, I practice what I preach. I'm in a group of people like really high performing entrepreneurs in this consulting space. I knew how to grow a retail space, but I didn't know how to grow something in consulting. So one of the first things I did was, I spent a large portion of money on somebody that I trusted to help me. And it's interesting. There was so much work. I was scared to do it, but it was like, I was talking with my wife about it. I was like, look, it seems crazy. Like, it seems crazy to do this. I know the results I've gotten without somebody like this. And then I know the results like that he's saying I'll get. That's the thing I did first. And turns out like 90 days later, I had doubled my business. So in a very healthy way, like in a very, not like in some weird, like you go just destroy your list and squeeze it for all it's worth, but in a way that held, I didn't lose any kind of reputation, any trust, anything. Like it was great. And so I'm still in that group. And so when I say that, what are the ways I find answers? It's, if you are in a group with peers that are after something big for themselves, there's an inevitability where you'll be challenged to do the same. And especially when they care for you, and then you can say, here's the issue I'm having. Because a lot of the issues are just tactical. It's like, I'm at this threshold of, I'm selling, but my fulfillment can't keep up with what I'm selling. What have y'all done? And then here it comes. And that's just wisdom. And that's just people that have gone through it. So that's it, number one. Number two, one thing I did is I keep, like I mentioned before, like walking through these kind of open doors. And when I was more of a generalist, and as I moved more into being more and more of a specialist around the finances, this is a huge response. This is a huge conversation. Like, it's a huge conversation. It's a weighty conversation. And like, I don't take it lightly. And I just knew I can't do this alone. So I have hired experts, CFOs, tax advisors, those kinds of people to come into this with me, because I think in counsel, there's wisdom in there. And that's what people don't, I say people, I think that's what's lacking, is this like level of honestly, like just wisdom and what people are telling other people to do. And it's more like, hey, here's just this data, and here's how I'm manipulating this data to make it seem like it's just coming from me. And, we get to this point of like scaling some course too quick. And the work that I'm in right now is I'm going to work with a few people, and we're going to go deep, and we're going to find these patterns, and we're going to solve these patterns. And then once we get to this point where it's like, we've seen enough, we've gotten results enough, then we can move on. But this space right now, I think, is pretty fragile, and it's hard to put like a certain timeline on it. So I have just been like, hey, can you come help me? Can you coach me? Because I just need to know that I'm not off when I tell this person to do that. So I think there's that. And I think like the other side of it is, when I'm stuck, I spend time in silence and solitude. I turn my phone off every Friday through Saturday at 5. And I think that there's just something that, again, comes from just cutting out noise. Just cut it out. Silence and solitude. I'm reading some, journaling some, whatever. But there's just so much. Again, I think that we just had the answers. We're just not quiet enough to even hear it. We're just not quiet. We're just so desperate to find an answer. We don't realize it's just right under our nose. So yeah, I think that's in general how I do it. I constantly, I love people, and I love the insights that people give on certain, like the perspectives, and I think sometimes it's not always like, you'll see behind me all these, books, and there's a big season I had where I just went on a hunt for when the company closed of, hey, what did I do wrong? Like what was wrong with me or something? And nothing surprised me about these books. Like, it's a simple, like you mentioned EOS, right? And it's the book isn't going to tell you, it'll tell you some things, but it's not going to tell you exactly how to do it, because everything is gray. Okay, here, EOS, here's what your meeting rhythm should be. Okay, you can do that meeting rhythm and still suck because you're not having the right conversations in there. And it's like, everything is nuanced, right? So I think that sometimes our answers come from a place you wouldn't think it would come from. It's a conversation with a friend or a wife that has nothing to do with finance or whatever. You're like, oh my gosh, like that's it. So I think from a reading standpoint, I'm shifting to biographies and like I want to start like kind of opening my mind up to how people live their lives versus getting into some book that is a lot of times more marketing than it is just like tactical advice. So, but that's how I've done it, and it evolves. I mean, people come in your life for a season, and then now you need a different person for what's next. So, I'm pretty aware of that, and I try to both be the person beyond. Like I want to be beyond my clients, so I can coach them and teach them up to a new level. I want to have those people in my life. It's also great to have people beside you. And it's also great to be leading people. That calls you to teach it. So now you're learning it at a different level. Mm-hmm.
I'd love your take on when you say creative entrepreneurship. How is that distinguished from just entrepreneurship, just generally speaking? Like when you say creative, do you have like a certain style of business in mind, or just a certain way of doing business in mind?
Most visionaries are creative. I mean, the way you think is you're creating a different future. There's a problem, and the thing that you're creating that solves that is unique, right? Mm-hmm. So I think that when I say creative, I don't mean necessarily like artistic or things like that. I think a lot of the brands and companies I work the best with typically though are in those spaces. So like agencies or in retail, because I think language is really important, and there are kind of different kinds of people that get into construction, that get into retail, that get in, and I think that the ones like I want to jive as people because I want to make sure our language is the same thing, and so I'm typically in those kinds of conversations. But I do think from like a creative standpoint, a lot of people mark themselves as being like, hey, I'm not creative. And they really are. It's just like, but they're viewing it through the lens of just like style and, something like it has to be pretty or whatever. And I just, like one of the most creative people I work with, he's like a roofer, and he's problem solving for getting veterans into the field and creating wealth for them. And he's problem solving, how do you go into new markets? And he's problem solving for how do you outsource some of these services to different countries? And he's problem solving for a lot of things, but it takes a creative mind to say, how can I solve this in a way that maximizes, what the company can do and its efficiency and the culture and all these things. So in my mind, I just think he's creative. He would never, ever, ever label himself as a creative, but in my mind, I think he is.
I want to say thanks for this conversation, because I feel like it's been a really refreshing take on a lot of stuff people have heard before or heard about. So thank you for that. And as we start to wind this down, maybe one more question about, is there anything that you would consider to be like, man, this is my message to either the world, or like I had a billboard, or I could wave a magic wand and get everybody to just get this one idea. Oh my gosh, this is the most frustrating thing ever. If I could just have everybody understand this thing, it would help us all a lot more. Is there anything that kind of fits that category for you or comes to mind when I'm speaking about that?
It's funny because like so much of what I write content about is not about finances. So this answer has nothing to do with financial stuff. But I'll give you one about the finances first, and I'll give you this other one that's just kind of in general. On the financial side, it's just that your finances tell a story. And I think that a lot of people are ignoring that story. And we keep thinking that we keep justifying it, or we keep kind of, oh, well, if only this was just a fluke or whatever. And it's like, it's telling a story, And so we're very we can be very scared to look in and see, like kind of read it and what it says. And I think that, because I think that there's this thing is like, because once you become aware of it, is your responsibility to then act on what you're aware of. And again, my challenge to people would just be, look at it, talk about it, open it up, like demystify it. And like whether that's with the spouse and the home, personal financials, or that's with, somebody that's higher up in your company on the business, or just a trusted advisor on the business side. But that thing is telling a story, and there's data in there. There's a lot of really interesting nuggets that can tell you how to navigate your way out of it. And then the other thing would be, this was a quote that I read in a Brene Brown book, and really famous guy. You might even know the author of it. He was one of the guys, a lot of his work informed like Star Wars, like story writing, but it was the cave you fear the most holds the treasure you seek, which is like when Luke and Yoda are outside the cave and Luke goes in and, sees the vision of Darth Vader and fights him and all that stuff. And I think that I read that a few months after I left, exited the last company, and it was a really hard season. And so I just kept doing that. And sometimes it is that financials, like diving, that is the cave you fear the most. Sometimes it's the relationship with a father or a mother. Sometimes it's the relationship with your own kids, your own self, like those kinds of things. And I think that just taking a step towards going into it, so many times, just one, it typically is like, oh, this isn't actually that scary, but it'll lead to the next right one, right? So once we're in there, that shows the commitment. It's like, just let's take another one. And because the cave kind of changes, like it's not always the same one, but I think that I speak a lot about solving the core problem. Like so many times we're just solving symptoms, and these things that don't actually, they matter. And they might be really, really big, but we're going to solve it like, oh, wait, what? No, I got to keep going. I got to keep cutting. I got to keep diving into it. Like, what is the core freaking thing here? And typically what I find is that's the depth piece. And with depth, like you ultimately kind of end down into those conversations around purpose and a lot of that, like deeper, more spiritual conversation. But it's worth it. Like it really is worth it. And if you're playing the long game, and I think that when you envision like where you want to be when you're 65, 70 and who's around your table and how you want to feel and all those things, I'm pretty sure, pretty positive that you'll enjoy the life of pursuing what's in that cave and addressing it and, working through that, because it's just really satisfying and it's rewarding. So
not the easy conversations to have, but definitely worth it. And like you said, when you're walking into the cave and you bring a flashlight with you, sometimes the next step is a little bit more bright as you continue to take steps. And that's cool.
That's right.
Phil, where can folks find out more about you, or even see if engaging with you is something that they should be interested in doing?
Yeah, sure. LinkedIn is I'm most social on LinkedIn. So just Phil Sanders there, or philsanders.co. Those are the two spots that are the quickest to find me.
That's perfect. Phil, thanks so much for hanging out with us today. This has been great.
Loved it.
And our thanks to all of you for listening. If you're looking for a quick way to make our day, a review in iTunes or subscribing to this podcast would mean the world to us. Our thanks to Small Pond Productions for sponsoring. And this was the ProGuide. Learn from leaders, change your life. See you, everybody.